One of my favorite pastimes of the past year has been poker, Texas Hold'em specifically. I'm not a natural strategic mastermind, like my wife, when it comes to strategy games of any sort. Texas Hold'em is no exception. Over the past year, I've been learning how to play poker from six-time World Series champion Daniel Negreanu. Negreanu is one of many renowned experts that Masterclass has to teach you how to do what's important to you. I've been watching Negreanu's nearly 30 lessons on poker, embedded with many of his examples from TV tournaments spliced in. Daniel Negreanu's Masterclass on Texas Hold'em has really helped me grow fundamentally sound at Texas Hold'em. There are hundreds of other experts who can help you grow various professional skills or your abilities in various hobbies. Check out Masterclass today using my link in the show notes. If you treat yourself to Masterclass using that link, you'll also be supporting the show. Now, onto our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
One newer nation steadily increased in strength during the latter half of the 19th century. This nation had avoided colonial possessions during its early rise. But Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, changed course.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks, active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
The Iron Chancellor wanted the nation of Germany, only united in 1871, to focus on building itself from within, to avoid the expensive problems faced by superpowers with colonies. Otto von Bismarck eventually set aside his objections to acquiring colonies beginning in 1833. Bismarck decided to challenge a kind of Monroe Doctrine the British exercised in South Africa. The Gladstone Cabinet's handling of events in Egypt gave other European powers like France and Germany leverage. The British handling of Egypt in the early 1880s warrants a bonus episode of its own. For now, know that the British stumbled into a long-term occupation of Egypt, which France used as license to move deeper into West Africa, and Germany used as license to make moves in southern Africa. In 18 months, Germany acquired all of its African colonies. Germany acquired Agra Pequena and the rest of the corresponding coast. Before this, merchants from the Cape Colony and British merchants petitioned their respective governments to annex some of this land that would become Southwest Africa. But Cape and British governments deemed annexation too expensive. Germany thought annexation was well worth the cost. German annexation broke the British monopoly of the South African coast. Just as recently as 1883, William Gladstone had welcomed Germany as a colonial power for the improvement of mankind. Gladstone said, quote, "If Germany becomes a colonizing power, all I can say is, Godspeed her. She becomes our ally and partner in the execution of a great purpose of providence for the benefit of mankind." Germany would have every encouragement from Great Britain in establishing herself as a colonizing power. Gladstone further said, "Gladly shall I hope that she will become associated with us in carrying the light of civilization among the more backward regions of the world." End quote. Gladstone's tune changed by December 1884 to one that saw Germany as a dark force in South African politics. He argued for two limitations he believed should govern all colonization. First, it should avoid all nominal and fictitious claims and respect the prior rights of other countries. You'll hear in seconds about how disingenuous this first condition was. Gladstone's second suggested limitation, native interests and rights should be fully considered. Subject to these limitations, he thought it was for Germany to say how far it was in her interest to acquire colonies. The prospect of some sort of partnership between the Transvaal and Germany looked like a very real nightmare. South Africa presented an appealing place to expand German trade, and an ideal destination for Germany's surplus population to emigrate to. German imperialists even hoped to create a second German empire in South Africa. A German Transvaal alliance could mean further frustration of South African Federation efforts. So Gladstone made sure to annex the remaining coastline of South Africa. Why? So the British and their colonial allies could have control of all sea ports. If the Transvaal could get independent access to the sea, they would see even less need to federate with the rest of South Africa. Here's what happened. A powerful German merchant received permission from Denny Zulu, king of the Zulus, in 1884, to buy 60,000 acres of land, as well as permission to construct a railroad from Santa Lucia to the Transvaal, and colonization privileges extending 1 mile on either side of the bay for German immigrants. To counter this move, the Gladstone cabinet threw his previously stated first limitation aside. The Gladstone cabinet annexed Santa Lucia Bay by reviving a nominal, virtually defunct claim to that coastal territory in Zululand. Historian C.D. Penner writes, quote, "The German challenge revived half-forgotten English claims based on an old treaty made in 1843 with Panda, then king of the Zulus, by which he had ceded Santa Lucia to England. But England had never attempted any settlements, and because of her long inactivity, her claim appeared weak. In addition, Sir Bartley Frere, governor of the Cape Colony, asserted that Panda had no land to give away there, and Sir Theophilus Shepstone, who effected the first annexation of the Transvaal in 1877, said that the Zulu king had become a feudatory of the Boers 3 years previous to the signing of the treaty in question." End quote. But despite what both these British appointed officials said, Gladstone and Company revived their claim on Santa Lucia Bay. This prevented the Transvaal from having railroad access to a port outside of British or Cape control, at least for the time being. Before blocking Boer acquisition of Santa Lucia Bay, the British made another move, partially in reaction to Germany's establishment of German Southwest Africa. The only land between German Southwest Africa and the Transvaal was Bechuanaland. Now, those of you with a good memory will recall that the British intervened more in Bechuanaland affairs, partially because of the murder of Christopher Bethel, the maverick diplomat we talked about last episode. The British were convinced to establish Bechuanaland as a protectorate in 1884, at least ostensibly, to protect chiefs Monsoya and Monkuduwane from further Boer aggression. But that wasn't all. Imposing British control over Bechuanaland also aimed to block the Transvaal and Germany from easily linking up. If the Boers had been allowed to keep both Goshen and Stellaland, there would have been nothing to stop the Boers and Germans from cooperating on a railroad that finally would have given the Boers access to the sea along German Southwest Africa's coast, a railroad granting access to a port not under some sort of British control or influence. Now, lest we think that the British stepping into Bechuanaland meant a better quality of life for natives there, historian Kenneth Hall argues something different. One dissenting British official in the Colonial Office, Edward Fairfield, claimed that, quote, "The natives were in no way the better for our efforts to protect them." End quote. In 1885, Bechuanaland became a British Crown colony. The British sought to grant about a tenth of Bechuanaland to natives, but thought more than that portion would be wasted. The land granted to natives was barely enough to keep them from starving, and not nearly enough to be used by natives to generate revenue for the hut tax. Why? To force the natives to do wage labor on the mines or European-owned farms, to encourage more immigrants and capital to flood into Bechuanaland and make the colony profitable. Those deciding Bechuanaland policy justified this land distribution, saying that it was in the best interests of the natives, that this policy would create a desire within natives for greater comfort and opportunity for greater self-improvement. That dissenting British official, Edward Fairfield, thought this was ridiculous because the natives with so little land had no leverage, no way to hold out for better wages at the mines, the farms, or other white-controlled businesses. Now, at least in theory, citizens of a British Crown colony held inalienable rights like equality before the law. Not so in Bechuanaland. The British High Commissioner of South Africa, Sir Hercules Robinson, stripped natives of their right to have legal counsel. So if a native and a European had a legal dispute, the European could bring the best attorney their money could buy, while the native had to fend for themselves in this newly implemented British legal system. Even the Orange Free State and the Transvaal technically granted this right to legal counsel to natives within their borders. The British told the Bechuanaland's Africans that they could govern themselves, but when the British didn't like how the African reserves were governing themselves, the British reminded the Africans that they were subject to British law. When Africans demanded their rights as British subjects, those demands were dismissed as being fueled by European agitators. And let's not forget about those all too familiar pass laws that had and would mark South Africa's history. Bechuanaland's natives were required to carry passes whenever they left Bechuanaland. Yes, you guessed it. Europeans were not required to carry such passes. So were Bechuanaland's natives saved from worse conditions under the Cape, Orange Free State, or Transvaal control? Historian Kenneth Hall says the following, quote, African welfare was subordinated to European interests in British Bechuanaland, not because of a shortage of funds or a fear of European opposition, but rather because the officials shared local white attitudes on such issues as white supremacy, the status of Africans in local society, and the future development of South Africa. For this reason, imperial rule in British Bechuanaland fell short of the expectations of those who advocated imperial rule in order to protect Africans from the consequences of European expansion. Far from serving as a point of departure, British rule was merely a more peaceful version of a policy which aimed at the subordination of Africans to the interests and convenience of white supremacy in South Africa. End quote. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind-the-mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. When the British blocked the German merchant we mentioned before from acquiring coastal territory along Santa Lucia Bay, Otto von Bismarck protested British use of old decrepit claims and sent his son to negotiate with British cabinet at the time. Bismarck's son returned from negotiations without acquiring any of South Africa's coastal territory. However, he did get concessions along the Gulf of Guinea for Germany, in exchange for Germany promising not to acquire any coastal territory between Natal and Delagoa Bay. The British followed these negotiations by annexing all territory between Natal and Portuguese Mozambique. This did not spell the end of Germany and the Transvaal trying to grow closer together. Bismarck and Krier concluded a trade agreement shortly after, but Bismarck would not make any formal promise to protect the Transvaal against British aggression. Germany profited handsomely from the Transvaal's desire to grow closer to it. Penner writes, quote, "War hatred for all that savored of England drove the Transvaalers into the open arms of these concession hunters, who were eager for material gain and influence. They found no difficulty in obtaining President Krier's and the Raad's support, and in such a way were able to obtain one concession after another. For government posts, too, Germans were preferred to British subjects. Krier, who prided himself on his German ancestry, showed special favoritism by appointing Germans to mining posts. This policy of the Boer executive, naturally, found a ready response in Germany. It was applauded as being very encouraging for her commercial political relations with the Transvaal." End quote. When Penner mentioned mining posts in the previous quote, that raised questions for some of you, or oft-repeated history for those of you familiar with South Africa's story. Historian Iain Smith helps us all get on the same page when he breaks down the discovery of gold in the Transvaal. Gold had already emerged in Leidenberg and Barberton, but its discovery in Witwatersrand changed everything. Gold's discovery in Witwatersrand changed everything. It's hard to overstate this. Smith writes, quote, "Gold transformed not just the Transvaal, but South Africa. From being an unprosperous state that had never known genuine solvency, the Transvaal Republic became the economic focus for the entire subcontinent. By 1898, the Transvaal was the largest single producer of gold in the world, accounting for 27% of total world production. By 1913, this had risen to 40%. Within 6 years of the discovery of the Rand, that's Witwatersrand for short, gold had overtaken diamonds as South Africa's most important export. In the short space of 12 years, 1883 to 1895, the revenue of the South African Republic multiplied 25 times over. Capital investment poured into the Transvaal, some of it from the profits of the diamond mining industry, much more of it from abroad. About 3/4 of the foreign investment in this period came from Britain. By 1899, a total of £75 million had been invested in the Transvaal gold mines. The development of the Witwatersrand goldfields was one of the most dramatic examples of late 19th century capitalist enterprise in the world, involving far greater sums of capital investment than had been the case with the gold mines of Australia or the United States. Together with the simultaneous discovery of large coal deposits in the Transvaal and Natal, and the already established diamond mining industry, the development of gold mining constituted a mineral revolution in South Africa at the end of the 19th century, which changed the whole economic and political constellation of the region and led to the development of, by far, the most advanced industrialized economy on the African continent. Gold brought an end to Cape supremacy in South Africa. The center of economic and political gravity for the region shifted north to the Transvaal. Gold became the hub around which the whole of South Africa's development since has revolved." End quote. Couldn't have said it better myself, Iain. Many Boers celebrated the discovery of gold and the economic prosperity it brought. When one happy informant reported the discovery of gold to General Piet Joubert in 1885, Joubert made this dark, prophetic statement, quote, "You would do better to weep, because this gold will cause our country to be soaked in blood." End quote. Future events prove this statement from this veteran of the first Transvaal Rebellion painfully prophetic. Because the mining of gold required such expensive, extensive machinery, an oligopoly of about 9 gold mining finance houses emerged. The largest was not Rhodes's Consolidated Goldfields, but was actually the Corner House, owned by WernherH.Eckstein&Company. The Corner House controlled half of gold mined on the Rand. The Corner House also owned part of other companies in the Transvaal, so held a long-term interest in seeing the Transvaal develop economically. They kept regular contact with the Transvaal government and stood as the source of chairman to the Chamber of Mines from 1889 through 1902. The gold mining industry worked as a magnet for immigration. Mine owners eagerly sought cheaper native labor. These African miners traveled from far away to be housed and worked in horrible, deadly conditions. Mining companies tried to control their mine workers further by encouraging the consumption of or facilitating the sale of alcohol on the mining company property. This reminds me of what the British Army did several episodes back to keep their single male soldiers financially dependent on the Army by basically encouraging alcoholism, rather than the saving of wages. Why would Africans choose to work in these mining conditions? Part of the answer is similar pull factors that drew in Africans to work in diamond mines. See episode 5 for those. Both Boer and British colonial officials tried to make tribes as dependent on wage labor as possible by taking much of their tribal land and limiting the livelihoods of tribesmen in the process. Mine owners probably benefited a lot from a deadly force completely out of their control: disease. The Rinderpest epizootic of 1896 to 1898 stands out most starkly. Equivalent to the Great Wall Street Crash, this epizootic wiped out 95% of African herds throughout South Africa. The source of milk, the plow engines of the region, wiped out. The livelihoods, the only capital of some tribes and Boers, eviscerated. This surely pulled more Africans to work away from their tribal land towards work in the mining industry. However, the immigrants that would really shake things up in the Witwatersrand did not come from Africa. Smith writes again, quote, "The gold mines also brought a massive influx into the Transvaal of European immigrants, known as Uitlanders. A decade after its foundation, Johannesburg had grown into one of the commercial capitals of the world, as the original mining camp of about 3,000 diggers developed into a city of 100,000 people. In 1870, the total European population of South Africa was still probably under 250,000. By 1891, it had increased to over 600,000. By 1904, it was over 1 million. No census was ever made of the European population of the South African Republic, and so the precise numbers of Uitlanders in relation to the Afrikaner burgers before 1899 is not known. By 1899, however, the total Afrikaner population, including women and children, certainly outnumbered the Uitlanders in the Transvaal, though there may have been more Uitlander than Boer male adults because these formed a larger proportion of the Uitlander population." End quote. Single men made up 2/3 of the Uitlander population. These Uitlanders, these outsiders, came from all over Europe and even the Americas, but the English dominated these Uitlander ranks. Like many mining towns of the 19th century, Johannesburg became a drinking, gambling, prostitution mecca in the midst of the Transvaal, a rural, religious, and until the gold rush, a very poor nation. The typical Uitlanders, especially English Uitlanders, had no interest in renouncing citizenship in their mother countries, and the London Convention ensured these Uitlanders had no obligation to serve in a Transvaal commando. Yet many of these Uitlanders would start to demand more and more political power within the Transvaal. It wasn't long before these demands took on monumental significance.